Perfect. Okay, so those of you that are here for the second time, welcome back. So last week we talked about what sustainability is in the local community, what it is in our individual lives, and how it affects our local community and the community globally. So it's quite a complex term, but Jenny explained it really nicely, and we've posted that video on NIFA's YouTube channel. Is that right, Jenny? Okay,
yes,
so next
right.
week, perfect, thank you. So next week we're going to talk about marine litter and waste in general. So it'll be both myself and Jenny will be talking about how we create so much waste, how it ends up in the sea and how it affects wildlife. Well, I'm sure most people are familiar with that, but we'll just go into a bit more statistics just and what you can do about it. And the last session will be on the 10th of April, where we will have guest speakers from the local communities and local organizations saying what they're doing either about marine litter or about getting to know the species around our coast a bit more. So just before we go further with the presentation, we'd like to ask you a really quick question via the poll, which Alicia will launch, just to see what your motivation is for joining. So Alicia, if you could launch the poll now, please.
And you can select as many answers as you like, by the way.
Yes, thank you.
Did you have an hour in there yesterday? Mm-hmm. Did you? What do you have on? Harbour. That was great.
So I can see the poll. So Alicia, you let me know when when you're ready.
I guess everyone has voted, so just gonna.
Yeah. Do you want to read it out loud since I can't see it?
Yeah, the most popular answer is interested in the natural environment, and the second is interested in the local community. So,
perfect.
Yep.
That's really good. Thanks for joining in on that poll, everyone. Okay, so this is our agenda for today's talk. So we'll have a brief introduction from Jenny about NIFA. I'll give you a really short introduction about Ulster Wildlife, and then we'll focus on our living seas. So different types of species and habitats, so homes for animals underwater and in the intertidal zone. And then we'll have a really short call to action of what you can do to learn more about these kind of animals. This will all be about tops 30 minutes, maybe slightly shorter. We'll have a few minutes. And lastly, we're going to have a little mini pub quiz, which we have not trialed online before. It's only 5 questions. It's super short, so I hope you can stay and join us for that one. We should be done by 11 with everything. Okay, so Jenny's going to do this bit about Northern Ireland Fishery Harbour Authority.
Yeah, okay, so that's right. It's the Northern Ireland Fishery Harbour Authority, NIFA, or NIFA, or sometimes they're referred to as the Harbour Authority. We are an executive non-departmental public body, which does essentially mean we are a sort of quasi-public body that is sponsored by DIRA. We've been around for nearly 50 years, but of course the harbours have been flourishing and alive for much, much longer than that. There is evidence. There's records of Ardglass Harbour being a flourishing harbour back in the 1100s. So long history of those harbours. And we've got 2 main responsibilities at the harbour. One is to look after the longer term repair and renewal of the actual harbour infrastructure. And secondly, to ensure that the day-to-day operations of the harbour are running smoothly. And those are run by our 3 harbour masters at the 3 main fishery harbour ports of Portavogie, Ardglass and Kilkeel. So that represents the vast majority of commercial fishing in all of Northern Ireland. We also see ourselves as having a role in the broader community. So we do actually, part of this sort of work is about ensuring that we are actually not just exclusively at the harbour and the port, we are actually ingrained in sort of the wider community. Next slide. So there's our lovely harbours. We have approximately 150 registered vessels across the 3 of them, and between direct work in fishing and various ancillaries in processing plants and so on, there's a scale of thousands of people employed in the fishing industry in Northern Ireland. So thank you.
Jenny?
Yeah.
So we, for Ulster Wildlife, we are your other host today. So we are the largest local nature conservation charity. We've been around since, well, 40 years, over 40 years. I haven't been around for that long though, almost. We are proud to be one of the 46 independent wildlife trusts that work across the UK. So we're the only one in Northern Ireland, but there's other 45 across the UK. And we are driven obviously as a charity and supported by over 14,000 passionate members. So we do focus on protecting wildlife both at land and sea. Things that we do. So we try to focus on species specific if those species are key to protecting a larger portion of the environment. So we focus on protecting red squirrels, barn owls, common skates, different kinds of animals, both in land and sea. We protect and restore places for wildlife. So this is a picture from the Kilkeel mountain. Or for example, Peatlands Park, we're also trying to restore the capabilities of these bogs to take in, not only support larger biodiversity, so a bigger number of natural organisms that live there, so lots of animals and plants, but also because they have the capability of storing carbon dioxide from the air and helping with battle climate change. We also manage 19 reserves across Northern Ireland, and some of them are open to visitors. We also try to bring people closer to nature, which I guess is one of our main focuses. Where we do within the Living Seas team that I'm working with. We do rockpool rambles, snorkel safaris, all kinds of talks, quizzes, surveys. So we just really want to help people get closer to their natural surroundings. And lastly, we do try to influence government policy in a way to remind them not to forget about the importance of a healthy planet, both for not only just for the wildlife, but mostly for us, because we cannot get all the services from an unhealthy planet that we do now. Okay, so just before I start to talk about specific interesting species in our seas, let's have a look at what do healthy seas actually provide for us. So we all know that for us they provide food, that's probably one of the main things, but there's a lot of other things that healthy seas provide. So one of the major things is oxygen. So over 50% of the world's oxygen actually derived from tiny little seaweeds in the sea called phytoplankton. So when you think about oxygen, everybody tends to focus on trees, but there's actually just as much, if not more, oxygen coming from the ocean itself. So it also, since the ocean is covering 70% of our planet, it helps with climate regulation and weather patterns. It also runs the water cycle, nutrient cycles. So it's a really important component, which I'm sure you all know, to the health of our whole planet, literally. On top of that, it's also really interesting to note that, you know, given that the UK and Ireland are both islands, in the UK, 95% of all imports and exports arrive and leave via ships. So transportation is a major source of livelihood and employment when it comes to how the ocean is used. We also have cosmetics, other types of jobs, you know, maybe offshore, wind farms, all kinds of things that happen within the sea. But an important one to note is also medicine. So there's many medical products that come from the ocean, such as ingredients that can help fight cancer, Alzheimer's disease, arthritis, heart disease, all kinds of different things. So for the sea to provide all these wonderful things for us, it needs to be safeguarded from pollution, marine litter, exploitation over sustainable limits, and obviously we need to try and figure out how to regulate climate change a bit better. So when I say sustainable limits, I'm just referring that something is sustainable. So it means that if we keep taking from the sea at this level, we are sure that there will be and we continue doing this indefinitely, we are sure that the seas will remain productive and healthy and support livelihoods in the long term. So not just for the next 5-10 years or so. Okay, so the biggest threat to our seas really is the fact that very few people, and usually the ones that work at sea or study the sea, like marine biologists or other scientists, actually know what's in there. Most people just see this. And that has a profound impact on how conservation happens within the marine environment. Because when you talk about in the Amazon forest, you can clearly see satellite maps of how many trees were taken out in the last 50 years. It's a scary thought, but here we end up just really seeing the surface and we don't realize what's happening underneath. Even though this is actually, so somebody had said, I don't remember whose quote this was, but it should not be called planet Earth, it should be called planet Sea, because majority of it is the sea. So there are different kinds of threats to our seas. One of the major ones is global warming and the change that it brings not only to the temperature of the sea, but also it changes the chemical characteristics of the sea, such as, for example, the acidity of the sea, the levels of oxygen, and these changes affect all kinds of species differently. And if you want to think of a parallel, it would be, you know, if we didn't have 21% of oxygen in our air, we would not be able to live as we do now. So if you were to go higher up in the mountains, there's less oxygen in the air and you need masks. So little small changes, even though they sound like 1%, 2%, they're actually really big changes that affect the whole ecosystem, so the whole environment of the sea. Another big issue obviously is habitat loss from different reasons, but one of the reasons that we can clearly see is habitat loss due to pollution from whatever's coming down with the rivers and land. And that's how marine litter also ends up in the sea, which we'll talk about more next week. So when I say pollution, it's mostly chemical changes to the sea, whereas marine litter just refers to actual, you know, plastic or debris in the sea. Our seas are also really busy, and there's a disturbance to different kinds of animals, either via noise, because they rely on their ears to be able to either find food or communicate with themselves, or there's just, you know, accidents. If you were to see a map of the UK and Ireland, of how busy it is with different vessels at every minute of the day, it's almost overwhelming. But we need that obviously, and it works, but it is having an effect obviously to whatever lives underwater. And there is also, especially international waters, fishing over sustainable limits, which is an issue as much as it is for the sea, as much as for the livelihoods of those fishers that go for the targeted species. Luckily, Northern Ireland, most of our fisheries are actually within sustainable limits. So that's some pride to be given there. Okay, so life at our seas. So let's start with fish. I'm sure you all know of fish. There's loads of different types of fish. And I know these images are maybe quite tiny, but the idea is just to give you, this is not all the fish that we have, this is just some, but this is just to give you an idea of the different colors they can come in. We have two larger groups of fish in our seas. One are the bony fish, which means that their skeleton is made out of bones. And then we have sharks, skates, and rays, whose skeleton is made of cartilage, which is the same thing that we have, you know, our ears are made of. So it's a flexible skeleton. So I'll give you an example of each of the groups that I'll mention just as a fun fact. So we'll talk about kokuras today. So this little guy is the male kokuras, and it's a commonly found species around our rocky shores. How do I know it's a male? Well, it's actually by its coloration. So in fact, all wrasse are born female, which happens a lot around fish, and then can turn into males if the main male of the whole harem dies or leaves. Then the senior female will actually take the role. So this is what the female looks like, and this is what the male looks like. So the males are much prettier, but the females can turn into those if need be. The second biggest fish in our seas is actually the basking shark. Does anybody know how the basking shark got its name? If anybody wants to unmute themselves and volunteer to explain. No?
Is it because it floats on the top and looks like it's sort of like sunbathing, sort of basking like that?
Yeah, exactly. That's how it's got its name. Thanks, Jenny.
Okay.
So it can reach up to 12 meters, so 39 feet in length. They don't have teeth. They feed off zooplankton, so tiny little crustaceans and other animals that float around the water that we can't even see with our naked eye. And it's usually seen off the north coast, but it has come down towards Strangford Lough as well. So they are a protected species in Northern Ireland, and you can't intentionally or recklessly disturb them in any way. It's against the law. And this is how they look like out of the water and how they got their name. So you've got their two fins on their back, and then this is their nose. They can also jump quite high when feeding or simply communicating. So they do kind of remind people of whales, but they're not. They're sharks. Another example of a large fish, in fact, Europe's largest skate, which belongs to the same family as sharks, is the common skate. So it used to be common, but it's not anymore because in the 60s in Strangford Lough, where there used to be a lot of them, anglers would come from all over the world to fish for them. And they have one of those strategies where they don't move around a lot. They like to stay in one place, so they were easy to just get wiped out. So the common skate is now critically endangered, which is just really one step below extinction. So Ulster Wildlife has a project called Sea Deep that focuses on shark skates and rays, and they work with anglers to tag the remaining ones, so we know kind of where they are. But they also, we also work with citizen scientists, and we'll talk about how you can join this project if you're interested in looking at shark egg cases on the beach, which give us a lot of information. So we'll talk about this at the last talk of the series. And then a few, I'm not going to talk about dolphins, everyone knows dolphins, but you've probably also seen humpback whales. So it's not a common species in our waters, but it is one of the 24 whales and dolphins that occur around UK and Northern Ireland. So this one is quite popular because it can jump out of water and do this spectacular flips and flops. And it also has these really long fins that it's really easily distinguished from other whales that have much shorter fins. So they can grow up to about 52 feet. You can see them off the north coast usually, but a more popular common whale in our seas would actually be the minke whale. And the minke whale is a bit smaller. It's about up to 35 feet. And you'll only probably see this bit underwater, so it's a little on the surface or above the water. But the thing to note is that this little fin is actually about 2/3 towards its tail rather than in the middle, like most whales and dolphins. So yeah, those are two popular things to look out for if you're ever interested. Other animals that live on the sea much more than we think are actually Arctic terns, for example, and they are also called sea swallows by some. I've never heard that term, but apparently they are called sea swallows as well. They have the world's longest migration, so they actually breed. They're winter visitors in the Antarctic, and they breed up here during the summer, so this is kind of when we see them as well. They're quite social birds, and they forage in larger groups, but they have this spectacular migration from all the way from the north to the south and back. You've probably seen, especially around County Down, particularly around Dundrum Bay, the common skoda. So the common skoda is a sea duck of sort, and it peaks in numbers between December and February. So they usually breed around, so they breed again on the north between Iceland and Eastern Russia, so similar to the Arctic tern. And then they come down to the UK to overwinter, which is a bit warmer. They're also usually seen in large flocks offshore. So So they can dive down to about 30 meters to find the shellfish that they eat. So just to note while we're talking on birds, it's really important that when you're on the beach walking your dog or just going for a walk, it's really important to try not to disturb a large flock of birds when the tide is low, because they're either feeding or resting. So if you were to scare them away by accident, they would expel a lot of unnecessary energy, especially if they're preparing for a migration. And that can actually determine whether they will survive in the end or not. So even though it seems like a little, oh, you know, they'll just fly away, it actually has a big impact on them. Okay, so we talked about whales, fish, dolphins. Now we're going to talk about the little smaller things that we all call seashells. So seashells are actually two different groups. One is bivalves, and that means bivalves. It means that they have two shells, so they're kind of open and close. And this group of animals, they have a really, really strong little body in there that keeps it closed. If you ever try to open a live scallop, you'd see that it's nearly impossible without special equipment and a knife. But in fact, they're so strong that some animals, such as the wrinkled rock borer, can actually make holes in the rock when they're adults. So they start off by secreting a bit of chemical substances in the rock when they're younger, and then through sheer mechanical force, they actually bury into the rock. So that's how strong they are, even though they look like little tiny and not very interesting. Another group of things that we call seashells are the gastropods, so sea snails, all kinds of colors. A cute one that you'll often see on the coast and on dead seaweeds or live seaweeds are flat periwinkles. So this snail varies in its color depending on the seaweed that it's feeding on. So it might be orange, might be brown, might be yellow, and it's really tiny, about the size of my nail and my pinky finger. Lots of types of crabs we have out there. An interesting one to note is the velvet swimming crab, which has these back legs kind of flat so he can swim with them, thus the name. It's also called the devil's crab because they're very, very territorial, and they can very easily catch you with their pincers. So other crabs, you can, you know, touch them or examine them. Velvet crabs, not so much. They're really aggressive. So devil crab is also due to its red eyes, very distinguishable red eyes. And then a group that has all kinds of colors, you would think they're tropical, are the nudibranchs, which is really the scientific name for sea slugs, some of the sea slugs. A lot of them don't even have common names because only scientists will notice them or be interested in them. But some of them do, like this one is called the Christmas tree sea slug for relatively obvious reasons. So scientists give all kinds of names to animals. They're not always serious names. Then we have anemones, and probably the most popular one you can see is the Beelit Anemone, because you can still see it while you're on the rocky shore. When it's open underwater, it looks like this, but it can retract its tentacles, which is something that not all anemones can do. Some can retract, some can't. So more tiny stuff. So these are all things that you might have heard of, but then it becomes so complicated because a lot of things look alike, and there's all kinds of weird and wonderful, such as sponges. They can be, they can kind of look like your typical sponge, such as a purse sponge, or they can be encrusting onto a rock. They can have all kinds of colors and textures, so it's not really easy to tell species apart. There's also then sea mats, which look like corals, but aren't. So they're also animals. All these on this slide are actually animals and not plants, even though they look like plants. So the sea mats are colonial animals, similar to sea squirts. They can be individual or in colonies. They all look like blobs, such as the sponges. But the fun fact here is that sponges are actually very primitive animals. They are very low on the evolutionary, let's say, tree of all kinds of animals, whereas these guys, the sea squirts, called so because if you were to push them, they would actually squirt out water. So not a very imaginative name. They are actually pretty close to vertebrates, so all the animals that have a vertebra, even though they look very similar to these primitive ones. Loads of species in all those groups. And then there's also things like hydroids or seafarers that look like tiny plants but actually belong to the same family as corals and anemones. And then one more random thing. Does anybody know what this is? If you would like to volunteer and unmute yourself. Or if you've even seen one of those before. Okay, so these are goose barnacles. And goose barnacles are actually larger types of barnacles that float around on driftwood in the sea. And whenever the weather is quite stormy, they would actually be brought out on shore, which is when you can see them. They're called goose barnacles for two reasons. One is because their head kind of resembles the barnacle goose. And the second reason is because they appear just before the geese migrate all the way from Greenland and Norway to UK and Ireland. So there's actually a legend where people used to think that barnacle geese come from goose barnacles. So there would be, they thought that they come from trees and then feed off the sap of driftwood and then just appear in the sea. So that's actually how they got their name, goose barnacles. Can everybody see the video okay, just to see how they move when they come out of their shell?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect, thanks. So we'll cover what barnacles are and what group of animals they belong to in the quiz. So I'm not gonna share this just yet. Okay, and then a few important habitats in our seas. So we all know about forests, but what are the equivalent important areas in our seas? So a lot of reefs and sea caves exist off Rathlin Island, and for some reason there's a lot of animals there, like sponges and anemones and corals, that only exist on around Rathlin Island and nowhere else in the world. So they're really special animals. There's also important areas such as mudflats and salt marshes, like such of Strangford Loch. So we don't think of them much, but they're actually teeming with life, and they provide food for a lot of migrating birds that migrate all the way, down to even South Africa. So they're really important feeding grounds. An example is the light-bellied Brent goose. If you've seen them, they travel all the way from Canada to feed of these in the winter. There's also other types of reefs. So there's not just coral reefs, there's reefs of all kinds of things. And an example is the reefs that are formed again around Strangford Loch by the horse mussel. So the horse mussel is a bigger species of mussel that simply creates the whole, instead of the sediment or the bottom of the sea being covered by rocks or other things, they're covered by horse mussels. So they, that way, they support one of the most diverse ecosystems in Europe. So they provide a really invaluable habitat for over 270 other species. A few more important habitats are coral-like algae. So they're called merle, so like little red encrusting algae of the Antrim coast. And they can be over 6,000 years old. So they grow very, very slowly. And again, they support a specific type of animal community in there. Then kelps. Kelps are our largest seaweeds, and there's 6 types around Northern Ireland. And they usually create forests. So they do support a lot of animals in there as well. And then we also have seagrass meadows, with the most popular being common eelgrass, which is not a seaweed, it's an actual type of plant of grass that has just evolved to live underwater. So even though seaweeds are quite evolutionary, more primitive, these guys are actual plants. So there's a lot of word lately about blue carbon, if you've heard, which just means, is used to describe such habitats that can actually help take carbon dioxide out of the air and help with climate change. So kelps and seaweeds, even marl beds, are now considered even more important habitats than they used to. So these are usually protected. Kelp forests, not always, but now they're looking into those habitats with more interest because they can help us fight climate change. And I mean, if you're not a diver or you're not going underwater, you can also see a lot of interesting different habitats, so homes for animals around the rocky shore. So it all looks pretty much the same for the naked eye, but if you were to look into these animals more closely, they're quite different than animals closer to the water, and there's many more different types of animals close to the water. And that's because there's a huge difference between the amount of time that these guys spend on air, which exposes them to the sunlight. It exposes them also to different types of salinity. So salinity is the amount of salt in the water. So if it rains, if there's a river nearby, there's also huge temperature variation. Whereas these guys here that are about 80% of the time covered with the tide water, they have it easier. They don't have such harsh conditions. So have a look next time you're out, which is going to be the first call of action that I was going to mention. So when you're outside, just on the shore, take a closer look under boulders, in crevices, even traces of animals in the sand. So our eye tends to focus on things that move, so birds, potentially whales or dolphins or fish, but have a look at the little tiny ones that we talked about today. And just be careful when you're placing a boulder back to place it the same way you found it, because there's different animals growing on the wet side of the boulder versus the upper side that's exposed to the sun. So there's lots and lots of different things. You might just notice even differences between seasons or after storms and such. Our second call to action that we'll talk about more at the last session of the Know Your Coast series is to join one of our exploratory events. So join us for rockpool rambles, a snorkel safari. We provide all the gear. Most of those events are for free, or might be at snorkel safaris, I think, are a tenner or something like that. We even do nighttime sea safaris where we use UV lights that actually show the rock pools in a totally different light, both literally and metaphorically. So for those trainings, just keep an eye on the Ulster Wildlife's event page, and I'll also be in touch with those of you that have ticked that you want to stay in touch with Ulster Wildlife and NIFA. Also, you can become a marine recorder. So we run two projects on Ulster Wildlife where you can become a marine recorder. One is Shore and I. And Shore and I really focuses, it's a citizen science project for the intertidal zone, so where the tide goes in and out. And it's really popular. We have over 3,000 records of different animals since September when it was launched. And the reason we set it up is because there's a big lack of information around what actually is out there on our coasts. So all you need is your phone and welly boots for that one, and we provide a free training on how to get you started and work on your ID skills if you're interested. And anybody can join. It's made from beginners to more experienced. So it helps us understand our coastlines better. So if you look at, for example, this rock a bit closer, just looks like brown and white. But then if you were to look closer, you'll notice broad-clawed porcelain crabs. There's also some long-clawed porcelain crabs. There's also a few green sea urchins on it. There's tiny cushion stars. There's brittle stars. There's curries. I guess you see where I'm going with this. There's loads of stuff. There's also fish around these areas, like shanies that don't actually have fish scales, but they have this really strong pectoral fins that help them move around the rocks like seals would do, so they can actually get up on those. And another survey you can also join for free with us is to find shark and skate egg cases around the coast, which help us figure out where those species are in our waters. So these each contain one little pup of a skate or a shark, and when the animal comes out, this is a really light, it's made out of really light materials such as our nails, so keratin. So it washes offshore with dead seaweeds and all sorts. So you can find them around the beach. And the cool thing is that every single species produces a different looking egg case. So again, you can look on our website for that, but we'll talk about them more in the 4th series. So yeah, just a reminder that we have next Saturday, then a break for Easter, and then our last Saturday on 10th of April. So we have a few minutes for questions. If anybody wants to ask any questions before we trial this pub quiz. But just remember
I've got a few questions for you that
okay.
I've come up with while you've been talking. And if anyone else has any questions, you can either unmute yourself and ask them as well, or if you prefer, you can write them in the chat and we can ask them. So I'll just give you a second to do that. But in the meantime, first of all, extraordinary diversity. It's so many different types of plants and animals in the sea. It's amazing, beautiful to see. About the sea squirts, is it known why they do this squirting function when you poke them? It seems like an interesting one.
Yeah, so they have 2 openings really. So sponges have one or many different openings per little animals that live in a sponge colony. So the water comes in and out the same way, whereas sea squirts have water coming one way and going the other way. And the reason that they have water entering is because they feed off small particles in the water. So it's simply they keep this water in them when they're on the boulder where you might find single sea squirt. So they're not dry out, and then if you touch them, the water will come out. So you can try it next time you're on shore.
Okay. Do they mind being poked like that?
No, they're quite gelatinous. I mean, don't pull them or cut them with anything. But if you were to gently squash them, that shouldn't be an issue because they're very gelatinous.
And I guess similar question to that a little bit. For sea anemones, is it okay to touch those guys? Because they have their little lovely moving fingers, don't they? Yeah. It's always something as a child, I always remember putting my finger, maybe not just as a child. Okay,
so then you might know for some species you can touch, some you shouldn't. Basically, all sea anemones and all corals belong in this group, the same group as jellyfish actually, where they have this little called cnida in Latin, and they're really tiny little species, or a tiny little what should I call them, like little needles, microscopic, that they expel when something touches them. So different species are immune to different types of their stings. So if you've seen Nemo, you'll probably notice that they live in one of those anemones. So Nemo, those clownfishes are called, they're completely immune to the sting of that anemone. However, other fish and people, if they were to touch that same anemone, they would get serious burns. So yeah, if you're not sure, don't touch it. Beelit anemones, I mean, they're usually going to retract their tentacles anyway outside of the water to keep the moisture in, but snake locks anemones, the little green ones with the purpley bits at the end, those might sting a bit.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of questions that have come in on the chat. From Brendan, I see winkles being gathered in abundance. Do you have any idea on the likely impact this may have on feeding species?
Well, actually, we don't, which is why we have the Shore and Eye project. So DARA can monitor protected areas, marine protected areas, whereas a lot of the rest of the coast, there's not enough information, baseline information, which is why we've set up Shore and Eye, and we have over 100 volunteers. In fact, I think it's more closer to 200 at the minute. So if you're interested to join and help us explore that and inform DARA, because at the end of the Shore and Eye, all the data goes to DARA and the main UK recording center for all this information. You're more than welcome, because we don't know. It probably does have an impact, I worry, but because there's no regulation around it, and currently anybody can pick them. But the answer is we don't know.
Okay. Are all crab types edible?
Depends what you like, I guess. I mean, from a logistical point of view, yes, you can cook them and eat them. I I don't think they all taste good, or I don't think they're all easy to get out of their shell or clean them. So I think we usually eat the brown edible crab. They probably have a bit more meat in them, and I think we do also eat the velvet crabs. I haven't tried them, but I've seen them being fished.
Yeah.
Grabbed for.
Okay. Should we eat certain species seasonally to preserve their populations more effectively?
Ideally, yes, but that really largely depends on whether you're eating fresh fish and sea fish and shellfish. So if you're buying it from wherever it comes from frozen, then the seasonality doesn't really have an effect there. But otherwise, yes, if you were to eat them according to the season, it would be the same as how we cannot eat a lot of types of meat. Like we don't always get access to baby lamb or things like that, because they need to reproduce. So we all understand how that works. Or venison, for example, we can only eat venison certain times of the year, and everybody is happy with that. But the sea functions the same way. Fish need their time to reproduce in order to keep the populations going.
There's definitely different times of year where there's different populations of types of fish that our fishermen go out and catch differently in different seasons. So it's something we can talk about another day if that's what we want to. Okay, last question. Are large amounts of dead seaweeds washed up on shore an indicator of a problem, or just part of the natural cycle?
Oh, that's a very nice question. No, they're not an indicator of a problem. They're just washed ashore after strong currents or strong waves. So it's actually not an issue at all. However, taking these dead seaweeds off the beach to make it look clean is a problem, because even when they start smelling badly, they still support a lot of different animals on the beach once they wash ashore. So yeah, they're important. They're the same as dead trees. You shouldn't really move them from the forest if you want the forest to thrive.
I guess that's a little bit of the point of our talk next week about marine litter. Litter is anything that's not meant to be there, that is sort of man-made and isn't part of its sort of natural world and cycle there. So it makes a lot of sense. Okay, so that's all your questions. I know you've got plans for your quiz, and it's 47 minutes past.